Well, not exactly that. Actually, more. In Parshas Toldos, the Torah tells us about Yitzchak having to go down to Eretz Plishtim, to the land of the Philistines, which was part of Eretz Yisrael, and because there was a famine in the land, according to the Medrash, the famine was even greater than the famine that took place in the time of Avraham Avinu, that necessitated Abraham, to go down to the land of the Philistines. And Torah tells us about how Avimelech, not knowing that Rivka was married to Yitzchak, he thought that Rivka was the sister of Yitzchak, and so he wanted her to be his wife, and whatever went on over there. Okay, ultimately, Avimelech tells Yitzchak that the people in the country are somewhat jealous of him because of the great wealth that he attained, and he suggests to Avram that Avram leave his land. And the way Rashi explains it, shortly before Avram left his land, so there were the wells that Avram had dug when he was there in the land of the Plishtim, when during the earlier famine, and while at that time he did encounter difficulty with some of the Philistines because they were taking or stealing water from his wells, but nevertheless, they didn't fill up the wells with earth. They kept the wells, they used the wells illegally, but after Avram died, so the Philistines, they actually filled up the wells, and the claim that they gave, why it was necessary, after all, there was a covenant, a bris, a treaty between Avram and Avimelech, that there was a treaty, and to stuff up the wells and close the wells was a violation of that treaty. But nevertheless, some of the Philistines claimed that invading troops would come into their country and use the wells for themselves. So because of that, they covered up the wells. Now, I don't think that was the real reason. I think, but this was only after the Torah emphasizes that this was only after the death of Avram. Only after the death of Avram did they fill up the wells. So it seems that it was the death of Avram that caused them to fill up the wells. So most of the commentaries, in order to explain what was the difference before the death of Avram and after the death of Avram, they say, out of respect for Avram, who was recognized as an Nasi Elokim b'Sochenu, as a prince of God in our midst, they did not stuff up the wells. As a matter of fact, they had this sense that perhaps Avram would return. But after Avram died, so because of that, after Avram's death, they decided to fill up the wells with earth, that the wells should not exist anymore. And one of the questions we'll deal later with is, what is the significance? And I want to suggest a different explanation than the explanation offered by the commentaries. What is the significance of the death of Avram? That prior to the death of Avram, while they used the wells illegally, they trespassed, but nevertheless, they didn't stuff it up. After the death of Avram, they felt that it was necessary to fill it up. Now, but then, afterwards, so Yitzchak redug those wells. And the question is, why did Yitzchak redig those wells? Why was it so important? And not only he redug the wells, but the Torah tells us the wells that were dug by Avram, when Yitzchak redug them, he gave them the same names that Avram gave the wells. So Yitzchak wanted those wells to be identified with the wells of Avraham Avinu. But then after redigging the wells that Avram had dug, so Yitzchak dug 3 more wells. And on the first 2 wells that Yitzchak dug, there was fighting between Yitzchak, or the workers of Yitzchak, and some of the Philistines, some of the Plishtim. And the Torah tells us that the first well, because of the fighting, so Yitzchak called it Asek, involved, because he was involved in the disputes and in the confrontations that were involved as a result of the well. He couldn't just leave it alone. There was constant involvement. And then the second well that he dug, that Yitzchak himself dug, and these wells were wells, additional wells, not the wells that were dug by Avraham Avinu. The second well was Sitna, which is identified with hatred. And there too, there was fighting. And that's why it was called Sitna. But then Yitzchak dug a third well, which was called Rechovos, spaciousness. And there was no fighting. It was accepted, it was peaceful. And the Ramban and the other commentaries are somewhat troubled. Why does the Torah go into such detail about the 3 wells that Yitzchak dug over and above the wells of Avraham Avinu? In addition to the wells that were dug by his father Abraham. It seems that it's not significant enough to have been included in the Torah. And the Ramban says that really these 3 wells are a remez, are an indication of what is going to happen in the future to the Jewish people. The 3 wells represent the 3 Batei Mikdash, the 3 temples. The first temple that was built by Shlomo HaMelech, by King Solomon, and was destroyed by the Babylonians. The second well corresponds with the temple, with the Beis HaMikdash of the second Commonwealth that was built by Ezra HaSofer and was destroyed by the Romans. And the third well, the one that was Rechovos, that there was no fighting over. The one that, in a sense, represented spaciousness, not just physical spaciousness, but mental spaciousness. So that well corresponds with the third Beis Hamikdash, the third temple that will be rebuilt in the time of Mashiach, when Mashiach comes. So, according to the commentaries, it seems that the wells correspond with the three Batei Mikdash on a drush level. So we have to understand the drush level. The simple explanation of the Torah, it's talking about wells. But on a drush level, it's talking about the Beis Hamikdash of the future. In a sense, it could perhaps be attributed to the fact, Ma'asavos similar bonim, whatever happened to the avos happens to the children, or vice versa. Whatever is going to happen to the descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, there is something reminiscent of it in the times of the patriarchs, an indication about what would happen, perhaps to serve as a guide for the future, but for whatever reason. So, but the question is, what is the analogy between wells and the Batei Mikdash? Now, I should point out that the Mefarshim explain the first well that Yitzchak dug himself, the first added well, I should say, the first added well called Asek involved. He said, why? Because the Babylonians, it wasn't so much against the Jewish people as it was due to the fact that they were interested in conquest, in conquering, in taking control. But in order to take control of the land of Israel, they had to engage in warfare. And in the process, they destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. So the first well is identified with the first temple. The second well, Sitna, so the commentaries say, the Romans, it wasn't just that they were interested in a conquest and taking control, but the Romans had a hatred for the Jewish people as well. And that hatred extended long past the time of the Churban, long past. And in a sense, we could suggest that hatred was inherited by the successors of the Roman nation. And that hatred is there, perhaps, even till this day. But what is the relationship between the wells and the Beis Hamikdash? That on a Jewish level, the Beis Hamikdash should be identified with the wells in this parsha. And then, this is an explanation about the significance of the wells of Yitzchak. But the question is, what is the significance of the wells of Avram? Now we can understand perhaps why the wells of Yitzchak, more so than the wells of Avram, are identified with the Beis Hamikdash. Because Yitzchak is the symbol of Avodah, the symbol of service. And being the symbol of service, he is identified with the Beis Hamikdash, perhaps more so than anyone else of the patriarchs. He was the korban, he was the sacrifice. He was put on the Mizbeach, he was put on the altar. And as our sages tell us, of course, we have to understand it, and that's not for this year, that future generations knew where to place the altar in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple, only because they saw, perhaps B'mara and Nevuah, but they saw the Afro Shel Yitzchak. They saw the ashes of Yitzchak. Now, what ashes of Yitzchak, that's a separate question. But Yitzchak is identified with the placing of the Mizbeach, with the placing of the altar. And it should be noted, even though from the Ramban it seems a different, there is a different pshat given, but the Rambam says the main purpose of the Beis Hamikdash, the main purpose of the temple, was to have a place for the altar, a place where the Jewish people would come to give karbanos, to give sacrifices, and a place for the Shlosh Regal. So the main function of the Beis Hamikdash, according to the Rambam, was to have a place for the Avodah. And Yitzchak, more than anybody else, represented the idea of Avodah, of service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Consequently, the wells that he added, the new wells that he opened up, that were never opened up before, they are identified with the Beis Hamikdash. But we have to understand why wells. What's the significance of wells? Now, in the past, I've talked many times about the double relationship that exists between God and the Jewish people. Now, in the Odds Yashir, I mentioned the question, actually, that Avraham Avinu, that Yaakov, when he stood at base camp and he took an oath and he said, "Im Yiyel Ekimi Madi, if God will be with me, Ushmarani b'derech hazeh asher anochi holech, and he'll watch over me in this path. B'nasan li lechem lechol, and will give me bread to eat. Ubeged lubosh, and clothes to wear. V'shavti b'shalma beis abi, and I'll return in peace to my father's house. V'hayashim li le'elokim. V'eben azos, and this stone, asher samti matzeva, that I made as a monument. Yiyeh Beis Elokim, will be a house of God, will be the Beis Hamikdash, will be the temple. Now, the two questions. First of all, what is the relationship between this haptacha, this commitment of God, if God watches over him and takes care of his necessities? So this stone will be a Beis Elokim, will be a house of God. And even more troubling is Yaakov Avinu, the Bechir Avos, the chosen one of the patriarchs. He says, God, if you'll be good to me, you'll give me clothes to wear, food to eat, you return me to my father's house, then you'll be my God. Implication that otherwise, chas v'shalom, could it be Olal Adas? Could anybody in their remotest imagination think that Yaakov Avinu is suggesting that otherwise he will not recognize God as God? But I always mention that you take a look at the 3 books that were written by Shlomo HaMelech, Mishlei, Keheles, and Shir HaShirim. In Keheles, Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, refers to himself as Keheles, the son of David. Why? Because the sum total of everything, according to Keheles, is fear of God. And fear of God is something that's given over from father to son. Yaakov Avinu, when he refers to God, he says, Pachad Rabbi Yitzchak. The one my father feared. And Mishlei is Musar, Tochacha, chastising, ethics. So in Mishlei, he's called Mishlei ben David, Mishlei, the son of David. Why? Shma b'ni Musar bika. Because ethics, Tochacha, that's something that's given over from parent to child. Today, it seems that it has sometimes been reversed. From teacher to student, that also now more and more seems to be being reversed. So, but Shir HaShirim, they're Shir HaShirim Asher L'Shlomo. It's just the Solomon. Why? Because when it comes to a love relationship is a personal relationship. There is no room for the parent. The love relationship between Shlomo and God, there is no room for David. David had his own relationship with God. So the Beis Hamikdash, the Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, he said, if God will be with me and give me bread to eat, clothes to wear, and I'll return to my father's house, God will be my God. Every Jew has a double relationship with God. On one hand, God is the God of our ancestors. We have a relationship with God because of the perception of God in the life of our ancestors. But then we have a personal relationship. We say in the Shemona Esrei every day, Elokeinu, our God, and the God of our ancestors. We have a double relationship with God. Keheles and Mishlei, that's Elokei Avoseinu. That's the God of our ancestors. That represents what we got from them. They're part of that relationship. But the love relationship, that's Elokeinu. That's our personal relationship with God. So Yaakov Avinu said, till now, I was in my father's tent, in Yitzchak's tent. And spiritually, Yitzchak dominated the scene. But now that I'm forced to leave Yitzchak's tent, I will use this opportunity to strengthen my personal relationship with God. And I won't need miracles for it. The things, what's involved in a love relationship? There are those that believe a love relationship manifests itself in the special trips that a married couple takes together. There are those that believe it might be part of it, not denying that. It's the presents, the diamonds. But most important to the love relationship is the things that everybody takes for granted. The lechem lechol, the beged lubos, the shafti b'shalom beisavi. Those are the things that are very important for a love relationship. And it's interesting, So, V'haya Hashem li le'elokim, God will be my God. And the Beis Hamikdash, what does the Beis Hamikdash represent? The Beis Hamikdash was the house of God. And when God gave the mitzvah of making a Beis Hamikdash, he says, V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'socham, and I'll dwell in their midst. The Beis Hamikdash represents the relationship of God together with the Jewish people. In a sense, it represents the marriage relationship. Mount Sinai was the marriage between God and the Jewish people. It was the chuppah. And the purpose of the Mishkan, the Ramban says, was to take the sanctity of Sinai and bring it to Jerusalem, to the Beis Hamikdash. So in a sense, the Beis Hamikdash represents the extension of the chuppah. It's the marriage relationship between the Jewish people and God. That's where we came 3 times a year. But the marriage relationship is not just when you're in the house, but the house symbolizes the marriage relationship. So the Beis Hamikdash represented the marriage relationship, the love relationship, the personal relationship, the Shir HaShirim relationship between God and the Jewish people. And I think that's very interesting when you take a look at the Torah. When the Torah talks in Chumash Parshas and the Chumash Shmos of establishing a marriage relationship, when Eliezer goes to seek out a wife, and that's by Yaz Yashir also, I should add. By Yaz Yashir, the Torah tells us, Zekeli vanveyu alakeyavi baramamenu. Zekeli, this is my God. But Anvehu, Targum says, I'll build for him a mikdash. When it's my God, when it's my personal relationship with God, that's identified with the Beis Hamikdash. Because the Beis Hamikdash represents the love relationship, the personal relationship, the Shachanti B'Socham relationship that exists between God and the Jewish people. Till that point, it was the God of their ancestors that came to redeem them from Egypt. But at the point of Kriyas Shamsuf, where the sea was split, the Jews saw themselves not just being saved by the God of their ancestors to fulfill the oath of their ancestors, but the God that wanted a personal relationship with them. And how does it conclude? Mikdash Hashem Konu Yadecha. The conclusion of Daz Yashir is talking about the future when a Beis Hamikdash, a temple, is going to be created, because the temple represents that personal relationship. And when we take a look in Chumash Parshas, when Eliezer comes as a messenger for Avram and for Yitzchak to seek out a wife for Yitzchak, where does he find Rivka? He finds her by the well. When Yaakov comes to seek a wife, and he finds his beloved, so to say, he finds Rachel. Where does he find Rachel? By the well. And Moshe Rabbeinu and Chumash Shemos, when he comes to Eretz Midian, where does he find his wife Tzipporah? By the well. For some reason, there are all kinds of drashos about it. For some reason, these marriages begin at the well. The well is the symbol of the initiation of the marriage relationship. And the Beis Hamikdash also represents the love relationship. So we can understand from a Jewish perspective how the wells represent the Beis Hamikdash. Of course, a married couple has to be married even when they're not in the wells. And it's very interesting. Rashi in Vayikra Chafei, even though from the Gemara I don't want to go into it now, it seems a little different, the Gemara in Ksuvis and Kufyud. But Rashi in Vayikra Perek Chafei says, Kol hador b'chutz la'aretz keilu ein lo elokah. So perhaps to a lesser extent, what do you mean ein lo elokah? If somebody lives in chutz la'aretz, it's like he doesn't have a God. What does it mean he doesn't have a God? But the answer is, it's the presence of God is more apparent in Eretz Yisrael than it's outside the land of Eretz Yisrael. So Eretz Yisrael also, not to the extent of the Beis Hamikdash, but perhaps to a lesser extent, it represents the personal relationship that God has with the Jewish people. I want to suggest that perhaps that's the difference between the wells of Avraham Avinu and the wells of Yitzchak. The wells of Yitzchak, that has to do, as the Mefarshim say, Yitzchak is the symbol of the Avodah. He's the symbol of the service. So that has to do with the Beis Hamikdash, with the temple. But the wells of Avraham, that has to do with the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael and the relationship that God has with the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael and the relationship that the Jewish people have with Eretz Yisrael. And I want to explain this a little bit more. In the time of Avram, as I mentioned before, the Plishtim, they did not destroy the wells of Avram. They stole from it. They trespassed. And perhaps they did not let Avram's cattle to drink from those wells. Although that's not very clear. But when Yitzchak, after Avram died, and Yitzchak became the successor to Avram, then they destroyed the wells. They weren't interested anymore in partaking of the water of the wells. Why is it? They gave excuses for it. But what was the real reason? I think the real reason is because Yitzchak, being in control of the wells, being a second generation, represented to them a greater threat than Avram. And I think there's a number of reasons for it. And I'll try to explain two of those reasons today. I think one reason was because that represented the idea of Masorah, of heritage, of giving over from generation to generation. And let me explain what I mean. There is a discussion in the Gemara, in the Talmud, about the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, has many mitzvos that are associated with the land. We have to give trumos, We have to give from the crop of the land for the Kohanim. We have to give maasros. We have to give from the crop of the land to the Leviim. We have to give from the crop of the land to the poor. We have to give from the crop of the land. We have to eat some of the produce of the land. In Yerushalayim, Meiser Sheni. There are all kinds of mitzvos that are dependent upon the land, that have to do with the agricultural growth of the land, how it's to be used, for what it's to be used. And that emanated from the Dusha, from the sanctity that the land had for mitzvos, for these mitzvos. And when Joshua entered the land, he sanctified the land with that sanctity. And that sanctity remained until the Babylonians sent the Jews into Golus, into exile, according to the Psak of the Rambam. But then for that 70-year period of exile, the land of Israel did not have that sanctity. And they weren't required, certainly in a biblical level, they were not required in the agricultural mitzvos that had to do with the land. But then Ezra HaSofer, the prophet Ezra, he came up and he re-sanctified the land. But somehow, according to the Rambam, the sanctity of Ezra did not come to an end when the Jews went into exile under Roman rule. And the Rambam himself raises the question, why is it that the sanctity of Joshua, the student of Moshe Rabbeinu, when the first Commonwealth came to an end, then the Jews went into Babylonian exile. So that sanctity disappeared. And the land lost its significance in regard to the mitzvos, the agricultural mitzvos that have to do with the land. But the sanctity that was bestowed at the beginning of the Second Commonwealth by Ezra HaSofer, that remained a permanent dusha, a permanent sanctity. And the Rambam says, because when Joshua came into land, how did he sanctify the land? He sanctified the land through kibush, through conquest. He conquered the land from the Canaanites. And he says, a sanctity that is bestowed by conquest is only temporary. It only lasts as long as the conquest lasts. But when Ezra came up, they did not come up with armies. They came up as farmers. They worked on the land. They demonstrated their ownership on the land by working on it, by cultivating the land, by building on the land. That's chazakah. Because it's chazakah, so the demonstration of ownership. So because of that sanctity is forever. Now what is conquest? But the question, the Kesef Mishnah asks, everybody asks the question. He says, even after Yoshua, Yoshua, for 14 years, 7 years of conquest, 7 years of distribution of the land, 14 years. But then The Jewish people worked on the land. They built on the land. They built homes. They plowed the land. They harvested the land. So the first dusha, the sanctity of the first commonwealth should have also been a permanent sanctity. And the answer, I think, is conquest is identified, if I could use a word that is used by our enemies, is occupation. If that which we obtain through conquest is perceived, everything we do afterwards is perceived as a continuation of the occupation. It's part of the kibush. It's part of the conquest. So to a certain sense, from a certain perspective, it's not identification with the land as our home. Of course, Eretz Yisrael is our home. But the action of conquest doesn't demonstrate that it's our home. It could be a territory. They say that in the old days, the sun never set on the British Empire. But India, which was part of the British Empire, was never England. Even Canada, where they have pictures of the Queen, was never England. It was a territory of England. It was under the control of England. Conquest and conquest is not indicative of true identification with the land. For the dusha to be permanent, we have to have an action that indicates true identification with the land. When we come up to the land without an army, and we work on the land, and we have control of the land through the work that we do on the land, then that's chazaka. There the sanctity is forever. And I think that's specifically true. It's very interesting. Yitzchak, just before the Torah tells us about this, the Torah tells us about Yitzchak planting. To a certain degree, that was a deviation from the regular practice of the Avos. The regular practice of the Avos and Yitzchak's practice also, they were mainly shepherds. But Yitzchak actually plants on the land. He has crops on the land. That was a demonstration of chazaka. But even more than planting on the land, I think, the digging of the wells, planting and harvesting on the land, even more than the planting and harvesting on the land, the digging of the wells shows chazaka. Why? Because when we plant on the land to a certain degree, each year we plant. So it shows ownership over the land. It's a demonstration of ownership. But when you dig a well, you don't dig a well just for 1 year. A well is a permanent fixture. It seems that and I think this was the point that Abraham and Yitzchak, when he redug the wells of Avraham, they were digging those wells to demonstrate permanent their perspective that Eretz Yisrael will permanently be part of the Jewish people, the land of the Jewish people. But their neighbors, the Plishtim, did not realize the implication until Avram died. And at that point, they felt threatened, and perhaps threatened more by the wells of Avram than by the wells of Yitzchak. Because the wells of Avram were now entering into a second generation. It was a Masorah. The wells of Yitzchak, it was just one generation. And in their minds, we want the water is ours. The purpose of the wells of Yitzchak was an indication of the wells of Avram. So he called Yitzchak called the wells that he redug by the same name that Avram called them. To say, don't think this is a first generation well. This is a second generation well. The land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people of all generations. We, as the patriarchs and the ancestors of future generations, we are digging these wells to indicate that this is the property of the Jewish people for all generations to come. And it's very interesting. I remember not too long ago, there was a big tumult, a lot of confrontation, because they were doing archaeological excavations at the site of next to the site of the Beis Hamikdash, of the temple, or the Temple Mount, as they call it. And the Arabs would try to destroy anything that was identified with the Jewish people having been there thousands of years ago, of the temple having been in Jewish possession. They wanted to deny history. They wanted to rewrite history. They wanted to hide what was found. I shouldn't say found out, because everybody knew it. But they wanted to hide the proof that the Har HaBayis was the site of the Beis Hamikdash, of the temple that represents the personal relationship between God and the Jewish people. And that's why the Philistines, they wanted to believe. They didn't want to be reminded that this was the well of Avram, because that well would then have been identified with the Masorah, with the giving over. I think there is another reason. Why they were more aggressive against Yitzchak than they were against Avram. And that is, Avram was a universal figure. Whereas Yitzchak, to a certain degree, was a withdrawn figure. Avram, as the Rambam tells us, went from place to place, and he spoke to large crowds. And to tell them about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yitzchak, on the other hand, was withdrawn. And in a sense, the Plishtim, perhaps, who drank from the wells of Avram, they felt to a certain degree, they might have felt, hey, Avram is one of us. His water is our water. Yitzchak, when Yitzchak was involved, Yitzchak was not so involved with the people. Yitzchak was not that universal figure. And because he wasn't the universal figure, it's true, Avram had trouble also, but he was still a universal figure. Yitzchak was not a universal figure at all. He was more withdrawn. And because he was not a universal figure, he represented a greater threat to the nations of the world. Because of that, they were more determined to destroy the wells after the time of Avram. Avram's wells, they were able to see, perhaps, even though to a large degree it was against Avram's will, but they were able to see that as their wells, that Avram dug for them. But it was more difficult once those wells were given over to Yitzchak. It was more difficult for them to identify those wells as their wells. It was the wells of the Jewish people, not the wells of the whole community. So because of that, they destroyed the wells. They destroyed the wells of Yitzchak. And I think that this is the idea. The idea is that we have to see Eretz Yisrael, as I mentioned last time, from the perspective of Avram and Yitzchak, from the perspective of Avram specifically, and Yitzchak, who reopened the wells, that Eretz Yisrael is ours, not just because in 1948, the Israeli army, through Mesiras Nefesh and Kiddush Hashem and devotion to the Jewish people, captured the land. But the land is ours as one of the generations of the Jewish people, as being from the descendants of Avraham Avinu. We have to recognize the uniqueness of Eretz Yisrael as being a Jewish land. It's not that we don't allow other people to live in the land, but the Jewish identity of Eretz Yisrael is being challenged. And there are questions that constantly arise. Mi Yehudi, who is a Jew? When the question of Mi Yehudi comes up, to a certain degree, we are arguing over the right of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael. When Ben Gurion was asked by, I think, the Peel Commission, what is your right to the land of Israel? And Ben Gurion said, he took out the Tanakh, even Ben Gurion, he took out the Tanakh. He said, this is our contract. In other words, the land of Israel was given to the Jewish people. But if the definition of who is a Jew changes, then we are not the same nation. We have to understand that Eretz Yisrael is ours because we are the descendants of Avraham, of Yitzchak, of Yaakov. because it is Eretz Yisrael is part of the Masorah. Harashtem Masorah v'yishavtem ba. And that's not only an obligation for us to inherit the land, but it's our obligation to cause the land to be inherited to future generations. And when the question comes up about returning the land or giving back parts of the land, we cannot view it just as a question of real estate, the way one sells their own home. We have to understand that it's part of the Yerusha. And just as we can't sell the Torah, Chas v'shalom, we can't sell the Torah because that's our Yerusha. Torah tziva lanu Moshe Marasha Kilas Yaakov. And it's our obligation not just to inherit the Torah, but to give over the Torah to future generations. It's our obligation not only to inherit Eretz Yisrael, but it's our obligation to give over Eretz Yisrael to future generations as well. But Harashim Asaretz, yes, we have to conquer the land. But when we conquer the land, we conquer it not just for ourselves. We conquer it to be able to give it over to our future generations. We were only able to conquer it because we were the inheritors of the land. And we threw out those who were preventing us from being in charge of our inheritance. Okay. All right, there are no questions today. Rabbi Lazovsky is not in a position to answer the questions. If anybody has questions, next week, I will try to answer the questions. Okay.